Right. Today, ladies, at this point, we are going to be talking about the process basically of determining what potentially AI can do and be most effective at doing, and what things should be left entirely human at this stage. It's a really interesting period of time with this still relatively new technology that is changing literally on a daily, if not weekly basis, or a weekly, if not daily basis. And I think 2025 was very much the year of experimentation, typically by those with deep pockets and extra people around to kind of try to make it so. But what was also interesting about that whole process was that a lot of these programs failed to produce anything by way of external value to these organizations. There was an MIT report published last summer said something to the effect that fully 90%, something in that neighborhood, of the AI initiatives that organizations undertook failed to prove any particular value. And I'm not quite sure how they measured that. I guess it was an issue of time saved, productivity, and those kinds of things, those typical measures. But having said that, even though those things failed, what was interesting, according to the MIT paper, was the fact that people were still very interested in trying to make this stuff work. And in no uncertain terms, they had to learn their hard lessons and go straight back at it. And 2026, as I'm seeing it, based on all of the chatter, is one where the CEOs, the C-suite, is definitely pushing hard in their organizations to say, AI is here. It's never going to go away. It's only going to get more complicated. We are way behind the eight ball. Let's get smart about this and let's act quickly. So get smart, plug into the right experts, and let's make AI work for us. So that's why I am going to kind of shape my offering and my training and online webinars and so forth to the space that says it's here. How do we engage with it? How do we plug into it and try to demystify, a bunch of those elements, and importantly, hopefully offer some useful guidance in terms of frameworks like we're going to talk about today, and actual steps to be taken to introduce things like AI agents and agent swarms and things of that nature. So today we're going to be talking about what tasks and responsibilities we should give to AI and what should always remain human, right? And this represents some key themes we're going to be exploring. And throughout this, from a pattern perspective, we'll talk a lot about how AI should and could augment and assist human work, but still preserve the unique value of human beings. And I think that's going to be the big takeaway. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of evidence that the CFOs and CEOs of the world, whose jobs are, to basically make their organizations more efficient, to ensure that we are spending money in the right direction, we are saving money, and that there's productivity on the outset, on the back end of all this. Their view is, at the moment, and quite perilously so, if we can get AI to replace humans, think of the cost savings. And we've seen some evidence of that. Having said that, I argue, and so do a lot of experts, that AI is not there yet. And the last thing we want to do is throw a tech tool into a bunch of very complicated processes and workflows and hope for the best. Instead, a lot of us would argue, I certainly will argue, that AI, again, is a great augmentation and a great support mechanism. It is not the be all and end all decision maker. And we shouldn't treat it in that way. By the way, I have to apologize in advance. I was just telling Zoe I'm suffering a little bit from man flu on the back end. So from time to time, I will probably have to let out a cough or two, but I'll try to mute before I do. So apologies in advance. So welcome to part 6 of how to make AI your HR superpower. Today we're going to explore the critical question: what to give AI, what remains human. It's a really interesting and pivotal topic, I think, for HR leaders. As you guys are trying to kind of navigate and expand the role of HR in your organizations. And so I'm going to outline some key principles to help us determine what the right balance and division of responsibilities between AI and the human workforce should be. And hopefully by the end, you'll have a pretty good idea of what that framework looks like for making these rather high stakes, decisions, quite carefully and safely. The pressure, as I was mentioning, to deploy AI and automate everything and cut costs is real for many, many organizations. There's a great example where IBM, as a matter of fact, about a year ago, created what they thought was sort of the Uber bot for human resources. So they call it Ask HR. Now, look, having said that, they've been working on this stuff for about 10 years and developing some really interesting machine learning-led tools. And so we're very far ahead of the curve, but they created this agent that apparently did such a significant amount of work that their HR departments and people typically had been managing up until then. And so they made the decision to let go as many as 800 HR people. Interesting in the wake of all that. Having said that, they just diverted those funds and focused instead on getting more salespeople, as you might imagine. Remains to be seen as to whether or not that experiment is working, whether or not employees at IBM are happy with that. But I have to imagine that what AI can do are the things we're going to talk about. What AI should not be doing, hopefully, are things that IBM has not adopted because that would be very difficult. Because, if we put too much pressure on ourselves, we're going to put ourselves in a bad spot. We're going to erode trust. We're going to hurt our culture, and we're going to, create potentially some very nasty compliance issues. And that's something we always ever want to avoid. So as a CHRO, you're not alone in this challenge, right? Vendors are promising massive transformation. Boards are demanding, return on investment, and employees are watching nervously, as you can imagine, as to how this all develops. All of which has, a knock-on effect in terms of internal adoption and how people are feeling about this and how they're supporting it. So today we're going to go through a decision-making framework that helps you kind of cut through the noise and guide you in making the right choices for your organization's future. The cost of getting this wrong in HR tech obviously can be severe. You can end up with, biased hiring decisions, compliance violations. You can have HR teams that are just overwhelmed in terms of, putting you into a competitive disadvantage, for the organization. So there's a lot to watch out for. And on one hand, AI can overstep and cause real harm if not implemented thoughtfully and intelligently. And things like biased hiring and impersonal feedback and that sort of erosion of psychological safety where people are saying, like, what is this black box doing? Is it tracking me? Is it sharing my information with people I can't see? These kinds of issues. Excuse me. So, but on the other hand, if humans are the bottleneck, just have to, sorry, admit somebody. If humans are going to be the bottleneck, it leads, recruiters drowning in applications and HR teams spending way too much money on administration and strategic initiatives basically being delayed. So we have to get the right balance between human and AI, and HR can really transform an operational function to a true strategic powerhouse for the organization. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute too. So, excuse me. What we're going to talk about today is something I call the CARE framework, which is a decision-making tool, simple to remember and understand, to help determine when to use AI versus, human involvement. So CARE stands for consistency, accountability, repetition, and empathy. Consistency is, whether or not the task required or the workflow required the same kind of approach pretty much every time. And if so, that would be a great candidate for AI. AI loves repetition. It loves guardrails. It loves rules. And it loves big, giant piles of data to make sense of. Accountability, which is a big, big issue for a lot of people, is really this issue of, can we explain and defend the decision that any kind of AI tool comes up with? So whether or not we can create transparency and, importantly, auditability, right? So we thought the tax man was tough. Wait till we get into some of the potential compliance issues. that can arise and the penalties associated with those just based on the EU regulations. Repetition, again, is this particular workflow or process a high volume, frequent task, kind of approach. AI loves to handle, repetitive high volume work in a very efficient way. And then this is the sort of red line in the sand, empathy. Does a particular task or a challenge, require emotional intelligence and human connection? These tasks, without question, are better handled by human beings in almost every case. There may be a role for AI to play in terms of preparatory work, in gathering your facts and putting your thoughts together in an organized fashion prior to engaging with these types of interactions. But you never, ever want to put AI in the position of dealing with those things directly. So the key is, again, finding the right balance and the partnership between AI and human involvement. And care isn't about choosing one or the other. It's about designing sort of an optimal solution for each situation. So let's dive into each one of these components and let's try to understand them a little bit better. So consistency is a key factor to consider when deciding whether or not to use AI or human judgment for a task, right? AI, again, excels when the process should be identical largely for every person, that has, again, clear rules and doesn't require interpretation. It may have an escalatory path. In other words, people might get partway through a process and be like, "Oh, this doesn't apply to me," or "this isn't working properly," whatever the case. And you always ever want to build in human in the loop technology, to let people have an off ramp away from AI for a minute and go speak directly to a human being. You never want to just put people in a tube and say, you can't exit the tube until you're done with all the tasks, because, of course, that screams horrible employee experience. So standardization is a strength for AI, and it can enforce, consistency really at scale, which can be super helpful. And that's why designing workflows or taking a look at your existing workflows and then reimagining how those potentially could work in a much better, more automated fashion to create that consistency and solve a pain as opposed to creating a new pain. That's really got to be the process. However, when the tasks, that require kind of a nuanced, context-dependent judgment, are better suited for human beings in their decision-making process. Things like performance reviews, accommodation requests, and promotional decisions. You would never hand those final decisions over to AI at this stage. That is a nightmare. You always ever want to keep a human and human judgment in that place. Again, AI can support, but you have to make the call. So the key, in a way, is to kind of ask whether two HR professionals would legitimately approach the task differently based on the context. And if so, that's all about human judgment. But if the approach could be identical every time, then AI obviously can handle that, from a constancy perspective. So here's a real world example of how a financial services company was using AI to kind of transform their CV screening process. And this is a very common use case you see pop up on a regular basis with AI. Their challenge was that they were dealing with a super high volume of applicants, about 3,000 CVs coming in per month, or I should say, yes, per month. And an HR team spending, I kid you not, 60% of their time on initial screening with inconsistent evaluation criteria across recruiters. So people basically were guessing as to whether or not a CV was a good shot versus one to be passed over. I've been there. I've been that guy at Goldman Sachs and a couple of other places where I did loads and loads of recruitment. And it's nightmarish. You can feel the bias building in your own mind. Your brain is screaming, I can't stand to look at another one of these things. And you're always ever having to remind yourself, what were sort of the top critical criteria I need to keep in the forefront of my mind as I'm scanning these things. Not a great task for human beings. It's exhausting and typically very ineffective. So to address this, they deployed a natural language processing or NLP model, and they used that basically to parse the CVs against very specific job requirements. Again, data. You need good data and you need good comparators and you need something against which the AI tool can measure and extract. So again, bad data typically will leave you to a bad result, right? Great data will actually help you massively. And these guys definitely dove in. So they were all about basically, creating sort of ranked shortlists, but required explanations by the AI tool, including bias checking to ensure that there was fairness injected across the system. And they kept a very close eye on that. The results were really impressive, though. They had like a 75% faster screening process. It went from 8 days down to under 2 days and had an 11-month return on investment, which is pretty substantial when you're dealing with volumes of hiring like that. The key insight here was that AI handled the consistent rules-based part of the screening process for qualifications, and then the humans, kept it contextually assessed, probably looking at things like culture fit, potential, and sort of intangibles. And this really kind of like demonstrates the power of the care framework: consistency, augmentation, reinvention, and empowerment, where AI again takes on the repetitive, consistent work and frees us up as humans basically to focus on the more complex, nuanced decisions and allows us time to kind of build relationships with candidates. And that's what really matters. So the key message here is that, again, AI should assist and inform decisions, but not make the final call at all on high stakes decisions that affect people's careers and their lives, right? We need to be able to kind of explain and defend those decisions, of course, especially when, there's certainly legal or regulatory scrutiny involved, or when stakeholders, frankly, need to understand the reasoning. And so we have to have that at our fingertips at all times. And that's why human judgment, I keep saying human judgment like it's a cliche. It's not. It's huge. It's critical in these processes. So I'm going to give some examples where AI can be helpful in an advisory capacity versus where it should not be, the sole decision maker by any stretch. For instance, compensation benchmarking and market analysis is an example. AI can provide great data and insights in terms of that. But the actual salary offers and the raises, through your pay process should obviously still be approved by human decision makers. And again, what's cool about that is AI can give you some great defense and great insight into the decision-making process. But again, you just don't want it to choose finally. Similarly, like AI flight risk prediction models can really flag some very interesting potential issues. We're going to share one in a minute. But termination or retention decisions obviously should never be fully automated. AI-powered skills gap analysis, can inform promotional decisions, but the final selections should never be left solely to an AI system. So the bottom line is basically we need to be able to sit down in front of an employment tribunal, right? Think of the worst case scenario where you have to defend yourself or other stakeholders and clearly explain how and why a decision was made. An AI black box is not sufficient, as we'll see relative to the EU AI Act and the way it looks unfavorably at statements like, well, it's a black box. We don't really know what it does. So we always ever have to be accountable and own those processes. So the key idea here is that AI should be used again as a support tool. While humans remain in charge of critical decisions that impact people's lives and careers. In performance management, for example, the AI analysis data identifies patterns and surfaces anomalies, right? Provides the manager with really valuable insight and can do cross comparison and things of that nature. However, the manager still reviews the AI's recommendations, right? And adds their own contextual knowledge, which AI is never going to know because they weren't there on a regular basis in real time. And they don't really know what your internal, decision-making processes are and things of that nature. The contextual knowledge is essential. And so it can help you, AI can help you with things like developing, once you kind of know what direction you want to head, can give you some recommendations in terms of how to present the material. how to do so in such a way so it's non-combative, that it comes across as being developmental in terms of its framing. That is great work for AI. But what you don't want it to do is say, no, you have to pick Jody over Fred, for this reason, and that's the answer. I wouldn't even put AI in a position to make recommendations, for instance, for things like redundancies or pay increases or promotions, because that then helps you avoid, just getting lazy and just basically letting, folks go ahead and just say, yeah, okay, I'll go with whatever AI says. That's a very, very bad idea. Okay. You have to make sure your decision is explainable, that it's defensible, and that the employee knows a human was ultimately responsible for that. Okay, let's get into this. And I have to remember to scroll down because it's a slightly elongated slide, but let's start up here first. This slide kind of focuses, pardon me, this slide focuses on severe financial and legal risks of not adhering to AI accountability, particularly under the EU AI Act and GDPR, because this gets ugly quick. Having said that, this is not a reason to avoid the use of AI. This is a reason to be careful with what you give AI to do and who makes the final decision. So human judgment in this particular instance is always, always critical in terms of this. So let's just start by taking a look at the EU AI Act's tiered penalty structure, right? And let's explain that these fines are real and enforcement began in August of 2025. So it is already up and present and acting. I think there has been some procedural delays as they try to figure out this model because nobody's ever been here before. But I just wanted to share with you that it's a real thing. And this diagram kind of shows like there's sort of three tiers of penalties associated with maximum fines up to 35 million euros or 7% of your company's global annual turnover. And so there's also this notion of double jeopardy, right? Of personally identifiable information exposure, also known as PII exposure. Where the emphasis is on personal data, right? Both the EU AI Act and GDPR apply. So they're two separate regulatory elements and bodies, but both of them will apply in that particular case. Um, and it's made me put my hand up. I have no idea how to make that go away. Um, doesn't matter. It'll disappear in a minute. Sorry about that. Um, so the essence of what I'm trying to share is that the meaning of a single incident can actually lead to a cumulative number of penalties from different authorities. And the notion of we can't explain, how this works, give us a break, it wasn't our fault. We're going to hand it over to the machine and say it's their fault. Sadly, it does not go over well at all with those organizations. So they're going to link it directly to where's your transparency? Where's your data governance? You're telling me basically it's a black box. The machine made the decision and you couldn't help it. Well, it sounds to me like you have yourselves a problem. And so we basically want to always ever stay away from the fact that it's a black box. And we need to make sure that the AI tool is programmed to explain very clearly why it made the decision it made. But you, again, never want to align AI with making those final decisions. You only want AI to provide input based on the data it can review. And so to kind of, highlight a common but, unacceptable excuse for noncompliance, I just want to reinforce the message, that ignorance and automation are not valid defenses. And I think the other thing that's really important too is to note that vendors basically cannot transfer liability to the end users. Consequently, you as the end users cannot transfer liability to the vendors solely, right? You're both liable because it's either the machinery and the way it was programmed or the person using it. Those two things in concert is basically where, you were led, to kind of understand, what the problem was. So That's that's important. You always need auditability. Okay. Um, I've highlighted a couple of examples of tasks that were well suited for AI automation, things like scheduling interviews and answering common policy questions, which it does an amazing job of. And it can help you even process, some of those more simple components, that employees need to go through without ever talking to an HR person, which is quite cool. And doing things like benefits enrollment and maybe even suggesting benefits based on your own personal situation. It can do a lot of those things beautifully, which is great. But, in contrast, we note that, the more strategic and judgment-based work, like workforce planning or executive coaching or organizational design decisions, should really remain in human hands, okay, if at all possible. The key point really is that the more repetitive and high volume a task is, the faster the return on investment will be from an automation perspective with AI. The one-time or highly variable work does not benefit as much from automation. In fact, can muck things up if you're not careful. So, as an example, a chatbot handling 450 queries a month and, reclaiming something like 90 hours worth of HR capacity can illustrate, the significant efficiency gains that are possible with AI. And that's just one particular use case. You can have AI kind of sprinkled in and throughout a variety of different workflows. Again, operating, potentially in a support capacity. But low end, low value, low risk, types of decisions and so forth easily can be automated, with AI. So the overall message basically is to identify the really repetitive, kind of tasks versus the work that requires human judgment. That's what's really crucial, I think, in kind of maximizing the impact of AI. So here's a case study basically that highlights how a manufacturing company, as an example, used AI and machine learning to tackle a 35% turnover problem in 90 days. So within the 90-day period, they were having 35% of their new hires walk out the door. And the HR team, frankly, was flummoxed. They weren't quite sure what was going on. The key challenge in terms of like the, exit interviews, people were saying, well, I feel disconnected. And that was their top reason basically for leaving over and over again. But HR just couldn't put their finger on why, what was happening in terms of that. So they used this AI solution, and that involved analyzing 2 years worth of historic data on demographics, on hiring dates, and departments, and training, and attendance, and exit interview notes. And the unexpected finding actually was that the single strongest predictor of turnover or attrition was whether or not new hires completed their safety training within the first week, which is really interesting. And people are like, what? And the issue was that those who were taking more than 5 days for safety training were something like 3.7 times more likely to leave within 90 days. And so this was sort of a proxy for basically production delays, and it left new hires feeling disconnected. There was a lot of pressure put on the new hires, basically to be productive as quickly as possible, get involved in projects, pass their safety rating tests and so forth, which are very real in the manufacturing environment. They are not taken lightly, and you have to pass tests and everything else to be certified. And oftentimes those have practical, demonstration components associated with them. So if you're trying to do that and you're trying to also kind of find your way, find your footing in a manufacturing environment, and you have people basically frustrated that you still haven't finished the things that they need you to finish in order to then jump on a particular machine or do a thing, that is some nasty pressure. So basically, what they did is they used AI to kind of reorganize the onboarding process and prioritize safety training up front on day one, right? And then the other training elements would tag behind. The company then was able to drop something like their 90-day attrition rate from like 35% to 19%, literally in 6 months. And so this demonstrates how repetition and data analysis can uncover some powerful insights. But implementing the solution requires, again, human change management, empathy, organizational design knowledge, context. That's what's going to be really key in these sorts of things. What if I just click on that? It doesn't work. Interesting. So let's talk a bit about empathy. And this seems to be the obvious thing, right? But in truth, this has been the thing that, frankly, most corporations step on themselves when it comes to really understanding the power of those moments when there is that one-on-one connection with people who typically are going through something, a challenge, an issue that they feel a bit like a fish out of water, solving on their own, and just don't feel capable of doing it. It's a critical moment that matters. So we have to make sure that we get this right. Um, it's really also a critical leadership skill, right? Especially for handling anything that's sort of sensitive and complex. It requires a very powerful amount of emotional intelligence in terms of the ability to connect, with people at a very deep level. In situations like conflict mediation and supporting employees through crises, delivering difficult feedback, absolutely require the human touch. And AI cannot replicate that. The nuance, the presence, the trust building, that's really essential for these types of processes. And if you over automate in that space, these moments can really quickly erode employee trust and engagement. It's really a non-negotiable line in the sand that should never, ever be crossed. Really interesting, by the way. Interesting note. I want to say it came about 3 or 4 months ago, where they reported basically that something like 65% of people who were using ChatGPT were also using it as a therapist of sorts, asking it really difficult questions that they would otherwise feel embarrassed to ask another human being about, apparently. And they were getting back what they felt were pretty useful responses. But the interesting thing was they recognized it was a machine talking to them. There's no way that the AI, as much as it could string some sentences together and say, hey, listen, um, I appreciate, what you're going through. I appreciate you're having a difficult time or whatever the case, and so forth. The AI basically would be like, okay, let me just kind of put some sugar on, on top of this information sandwich, if you will, and and let's see if we can't get away with doing this, and kind of moving you on to the next. But it's really interesting. I think actually even OpenAI said, well, with that kind of a use case, and there are that many people interested in using AI as a counselor, we are going to train a model basically that is particularly good at that stuff. Again, I wouldn't necessarily trust it. I think, looking at it as a resource, a knowledge resource, and helping you with the preparatory work in advance of a difficult conversation, and helping people, I think is really, really useful. I think it's a great information repository, but I would not use it as a way to pawn off these difficult conversations, with an AR specialist, sorry, HR specialist. So, this empathy boundary really kind of explores, the role of AI in supporting empathic leadership, right? While it also emphasizes the human connection and judgment are essential. So AI, again, can provide valuable insights, analyze employee feedback, it can flag potential issues, it can even recommend resources, right, to kind of help you have that conversation, but it should never replace the human element, the empathic conversation, the reading between the lines, and also kind of detecting things in voice and nonverbal gestures, and adapting your approach and building trust with that individual. That's really where that should sit. Okay. So the decision matrix, this care matrix, and I appreciate I don't have all four of them out here, but I needed to kind of start with identifying the task. This will kind of help you again evaluate whether or not a task or a workflow or a process is a good candidate for AI automation. So you start obviously always not with the technology. It's great to know the technology is out there, but AI may not be the tech tool you need to go solve a problem. You should always ever start with the pain point in the business. Start with, in this case, your HR processes, and have a good long think as to, where can we build in consistency? Where can we build in repetition? Where can we build in, excuse me, accountability, to basically hand something over that frankly we don't love doing anyway. That's not really what humans were put on Earth to do. And quite frankly, your C-suite, I think, would argue that they hired you to obviously have a very deep and powerful effect on the human population, difficult as it is often to manage. But AI gives you the option to do personalization. It can work at scale that you could never necessarily manage on your own. So that's the other thing too, is that you always ever want to kind of make sure that you are including all these elements: consistency, accountability, repetition, and empathy, and making sure that you're making a balanced decision around this space. And whether or not, again, AI can either fully automate or, in most cases, augment and support, your thinking around this space. Sorry, we're just zooming through here. And suddenly my Wi-Fi is stuck. Here we go. Beautiful. Right. I think I've jumped a slide. Hold on 2 seconds, people. Come on. Right. So I'm going to probably blow through a couple of these slides only because I'm going to share the deck with you guys, share this presentation with you so that you have it to look at your leisure. And I've put a lot of words on a slide. I've violated every presentation and PowerPoint rule, or gamma rule in this particular case, by putting almost too much information up here. You don't need to read it all right now. I just wanted to point out the fact that there are some ideas, some thoughts that I shared with you all here, in terms of offering up, in this particular case, sort of a three-phased approach that allows you to build trust with your thinking about what is AI automatable and what is augmentable, and how should we now think through our tasks, our workflows, the way we kind of operate as an HR team, and even have like a facilitated discussion, which I do a lot of, with the team to say, let's identify all those things. And let's then kind of prioritize what things potentially we can move to the top that are causing us the most pain, that are taking up too much time and taking us away from strategic work that we could be doing for the organization and helping them make intelligent commercial decisions about the direction that we're going. Okay. So that's basically what I will share here. Sorry, just moving something out of the way so you can see it. So again, I'm not going to go through all these phases, but I suggest you do take sort of a three-phased approach and kind of, pick and choose the things that really matter, and then kind of de-risk, those components carefully, and just take into account, the things that you think are worth, building out. Here we go. This, I think, is an important slide, right? There's sort of four common pitfalls that HR leaders should really avoid when you're implementing AI and automation. And pitfall one is this notion of solely relying on AI for things like performance reviews. And I know I keep harping on about this, but I can't tell you how many new emerging technologies in the HR space are offering ideas about, hey, we can actually help you get through your performance reviews infinitely faster, because we've got this decision-making module and it does this and it does that. And people are like, hey, that's great. Managers hate doing performance reviews. How cool would it be to press a button and then instantaneously you have 5 performance reviews all completed for you and ready to be signed off? That is a disaster. You certainly never would want to do that. But it certainly is very much an augmentable process. AI can really help you pull together some disparate components of integrated data and make sense of it for you and build sort of a 3D model of each individual. So again, it helps your thinking and your organizational process. And you don't want it to miss critically important context that only you can provide. Pitfall two, using chatbots to handle complicated employee relations issues. Yeah, never. It's just not going to happen. Empathy and judgment are always ever required. You can use chatbots to help triage and escalate issues, that need to be resolved by human HR professionals. But yeah, you would just never hand that over to AI. solely. Pitfall number three is automating, all your repetitive tasks, but not all repetition is low stakes. As an example, processing things like accommodation requests for disabled employees, as an example, or people who have, kind of neurodiverse thinking patterns and things of that nature. You just wouldn't say, "Hey, AI, you go sort that out." Nobody's going to want to share that kind of information with them to be a human thing. Um, and pitfall number four is not explaining how the AI works. You don't need to be a hyper smart, masters in AI technology, Uber engineer by any stretch, but you need to know how the decision tree works. You need to be able to show the data that it creates and helping you basically decide, where a process might go or might not. And you just need that point. So AI works, it's going to lead to accountability failures and compliance risks that we've already talked about, and obviously employee distrust. And that erodes much more quickly than it builds. So only use explainable AI and require full transparency from your vendors. Don't let that ever go. That's going to be critical. The key to this whole process, especially after that MIT article and paper that was published last year about the failure of something like 95% of the AI efforts and initiatives not producing any value. I always ever tell my clients, you need to kind of lay down some critical baseline measures and some KPIs, key performance indicators that you think are likely going to be positively and affected, but that show that your interdiction with AI is having an effect, right? So classic scientific approach, create a baseline, agree the measures, and then pick, integral times basically that you're basically going to iterate on measuring the relative success or not of these efforts. So that's what's really key. And again, I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but this is a really juicy slide and really powerful and worth kind of diving into because it gives you a sense of what kind of metrics should I be tracking depending on the use of AI, either as augmentation or as full automation. So you want to keep a very close eye on this. And then again, this is another way of cutting and slicing and sharing, how it is you want to phase the use of AI and experiment with automation. This is a process basically you can follow over and over again. And it's just kind of like it's really useful to have uh, sort of a framework basically kind of spelled out in a way that says, right, this is kind of the pathway we're going to just kind of go through over and over and over again because it's repeatable and it's defensible. It will help keep us honest. So again, I'm not going to kind of do a deep dive on that. I just wanted to make sure you kind of understood that was there to refer back to. Effective leadership, again, is critical for the success of AI implementation. The CHRO, you guys, must be the champion of a human-centered approach that focuses on, strategic workforce capabilities and not just efficiency. You will be pressured into saying, build us a tool, that basically will tell us what people don't need to be here anymore, right? And then we'll just get the AI to kind of cover what it is they do and hope for the best. That is as bad a business decision, I think, as has ever been created. And look, it's not just modern times that this is coming up. This has happened over and over again. Um, I remember with my bank, Barclays, and this was not just Barclays, this was all banks in the UK, decided that they were going to do away with local call centers who were plugged into basically the entire machinery of the bank and can pretty much solve any problem. And they thought, yeah, this is costing us a lot of money. Why don't we just go to, I don't know, India, Cairo, Southeast Asia, Philippines, and we'll just, create data centers there, or not data centers, we'll create call centers there. And so when anybody has a problem day or night, they can basically just phone in and somebody will be at the other end of the phone. They didn't give them any training, right? They didn't kind of socialize them from a cultural perspective to the types of customers that would be calling. They were from other countries with entirely different ways of thinking about everything, and trying to then solve problems. And it was just a disaster. And they ultimately ended up bringing it back, re-onshoring customer care, and putting it in places interesting like Scotland or Ireland, which worked a treat. And it's just been an infinitely better experience as a result. But that was a long, painful process that cost them a lot of money and a lot of customers. Um, so again, you want to make sure here that transparency and trust are essential. You want to address your team's biggest frustrations, right? And then find AI solutions potentially to kind of address those problems. You don't deploy AI looking for a problem to solve. It goes the other way around. Investment in change management is key. And this is going to be critical for you to kind of focus on. I know it sounds cliche, that change basically is the new normal. This is different. It's not just change is the new normal. Not only is change beyond the new normal, it's radical change at speed, right? And so this is what we have to basically make sure we remember. We have to get our people good at this. We also have to develop specific skills to help people be successful in the AI era, because this is going to be a very different feel to anything we've ever had. This is going to take the Industrial Revolution and compress it down to, say, somewhere between 2 and 5 years, if you can imagine, right? The advent of electricity, changing gas lighting in houses and things of that nature took decades to ultimately implement. This process will have taken us to another universe in a matter of a couple of years. So we need to prepare our people, for the way to think about these things in creative, open-minded terms, and to embrace the change so that they can start preparing for whatever comes next and have a very open mindset about this. You guys have heard of the notion of a growth mindset, human judgment, analysis and problem solving. This is what we have to become good at, because we have now the tools to help kind of bring that about. Okay. So the future state of HR is one where I think AI and technology rather, are going to free us up, right, as HR professionals and allow us to kind of focus on much more in strategic and impactful work. If you can imagine the level of data and the sort of 3D modeling that these tools will ultimately kind of provide us, we can have very, very different conversations, either on an individual level, on a team level, or in aggregate across geographies and regions and everything else and across functions like we could never have before. And that's what's exciting, I think, about this era. We just have to manage it responsibly. We have to be fair. We have to be unbiased. We have to make sure the machinery is doing what we told it to do, and we're keeping an eye on it, right? That trust component has always got to be there. But oh my God, the excitement of being able to build personalized services for every employee in your organization, whether or not you're 50 people or 300,000 people. How cool would it be to give them a portal and say, we've got AI tools basically that are transparent and seeable and auditable, that will give you access to anything you need, and to help manage your career, to help develop yourself, to help answer questions that nobody seems to have time to help you with. This basically will empower you to be a very experienced employee in a very short period of time. That's basically what we want it to be able to do. And the only way we can get there is by also looking for automation opportunities to get out of the business of being a help desk, get out of the business of being a CV screener, get out of the business of doing the laborious, painful, repetitive, low value components that are basically going to, take up our time. We need to be thinking big. Our organizations are going to be looking to us to say, what direction should I take? How do I go about this with my people? How do I explain this? How do I get them on board? How do I answer these really difficult and challenging questions? And then once everybody's on board, how do I engage with this? How do we turn this on? And that's when you can kind of share with them, the care method, the care approach. Again, look, there are sort of three choices for all of us. Path one is, is to kind of deploy AI under pressure and without a framework, which is going to risk, as we've talked about, eroding trust and causing compliance issues. And it's going to force us all to play catch up and clean up. Path two is to avoid AI entirely. And I get a lot of that, to be perfectly honest. I get a lot of people saying, oh, cool idea, not really for us. I don't think that's going to be anything we're going to be interested in anytime soon. And that's just not the space we want to be in. Okay. We're going to lose traction faster than we can imagine. And then, of course, the recommended path three, which is to lead, with the CARE methodology and framework. Apply sort of a systemic framework to every decision and build yourselves a human-centered AI strategy, right? And transform HR into a strategic powerhouse. The choice is really ours, to kind of figure this out. So I hope we all choose, this transformation intentionally, as opposed to reacting to it and always ever having to play catch up. This is just sort of a summary of everything we talked about. I don't need to kind of hammer on about that. You're smart people. I think you can always ever kind of catch up on that. But look, we've covered a lot of information today about how to leverage HR, in AI rather, in HR. So let's talk about some next steps you can take to kind of continue your AI journey. First, I think there's some helpful resources here on this page, some links basically to download some reasonably simplistic decision tree documents and things, and to access, your HR process audit template, to basically help you review and keep track of the things and the decisions that you've made, and some return on investment calculators. And I think these things are useful tools, right? In the way to kind of start putting, what you've learned into practice. And I also want to kind of, encourage you to connect with me and our team at Big Bear. I have access basically to user experience consultants who are terrific. I have a number of AI tech team capabilities that are global, to kind of build out the things that you want to experiment with. And of course, I do a lot of the facilitation in terms of the human-centered design activity on this stuff. And so I have, I think, a full suite of capability that I can make available to you in a very affordable fashion, in a very timely fashion. So you don't have to reach out to the big giant consultancies and pay through the nose ultimately to get a document that you probably are going to find gathers dust on a bookshelf and doesn't actually ever get implemented. This is the time to start really thinking this stuff through. So we're only at the beginning of my AI and HR series. Next time, we're going to be talking about the actual use and implementation of AI agents and where that stuff can actually go. That will be module 7. And we'll probably have that ready in about a month's time. So again, remember the future of HR, right? Depends on leaders like you, making thoughtful human-centered decisions about AI. So don't just let this be another webinar, right? Take action with this as soon as you possibly can and start your audit, apply the CARE framework to just one of your processes and have a conversation, with your team, and let's get the momentum going. So let's go to Q&A, if we could do. I can unmute people if they are interested in doing so. I don't know if we automatically muted people. I hope not. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute, and we will make sure to answer any questions. And there are no silly questions. This is new for everybody, so don't hesitate.
Jeff, can I ask you what would be a series of questions that we could ask our third-party providers to test the rigor of their AI governance data protection strategies?
That's a brilliant question. Okay, so this is when you say that, you're talking about basically, hold on 2 seconds. Let me stop sharing so I can see your face. There you are. Hello. Yeah, it's an excellent question. And this is definitely going to actually end up, I think, being one of my modules because I get this a lot. It's funny. I do a lot of work with the vendors because I'm always ever wondering, like, who truly has AI natively embedded in their
Yeah.
tooling, right? Versus what we call an AI wrapper, which is sort of
Yes.
like having a chat bot on the side. It's like, oh, I clicked on this module and a little friendly being popped up and said, "Can I help you with anything?" And that's basically a wrapper. Wrappers are reasonably safe, reasonably undangerous because they're really there as a repository of knowledge and basically want to kind of get you to the right information, the right article, the right reference, or the right person as quickly as possible. What we should be worried about and what we need to really query with vendors is, for instance, those who are building AI natively internally within their tools, such that you think about an HRIS system, which is really arguably a system of record, but it's a lot of records.
Mm,
Especially if you've been in a company for quite some time, you've got not just your personally identifiable information, your banking accounts and title and history and all that stuff, but you've got your promotion, your sorry, pay and promotion and performance data all in
mm,
there as well, right? As well as any other documents that are pertinent and so forth. These tools can basically look at all of that information. They can look at your early recruitment process and your interview notes. They can, kind of basically pick apart all of these kind of elements to kind of then start to create a pattern and almost sort of like a 3D hologram about you. The question is that 3D hologram accurate? Right? Is that really the best representation of this individual? We've all, worked with people who are rather unique human beings. I, especially in technology and biotech, there were some wacky, crazy scientists, so bright, so capable, and in some cases, very kind of recalcitrant. They were like sometimes
mm,
quite difficult to deal with on a human basis. They were very neurodiverse, but that was their magic, right? Their
mm,
whole brain was focused on solving cancer, right? On basically creating the building blocks of humanity and replicating that in some weird, wonderful way. Um, so then when the issue, for instance, of performance management pops up, and there's a lot of negative stuff about Elon, who's working with us, and that registers a lot of concern with us. Gosh, I don't know if we should promote Elon. This is not good. Like he's not getting along with other people, and that's one of our core values is collaboration and teamwork. Yet, nonetheless, what it doesn't show you is how many patents, that Elon basically has won for the company, which is, in some cases it might be 116. And it turns
mm,
out he is by far the brightest, most capable, and most productive scientist you have on staff. So do you really want to take AI's advice, basically, and make a ridiculous decision and deprioritize Elon's pay increase or promotional opportunities or whatever? Or do we jump in and say, ha, whoa, this is a disconnect. This is not good. Elon's on the bottom of the list and he's our top scientist. And if it weren't for Elon, frankly, we'd be off the map. So I think we need to rethink this. And that's when you, Justine, would jump into the CEO's office saying, I just found something not good. We need to rethink this. And AI is not our friend at the moment.
mm,
But it's not its fault. That's what we programmed it to look at, right? And so we need to kind of possibly sit back and say, let's pull Elon out of that AI mix and let's have a different discussion about the
mm,
direction it potentially could take with us. So that's just an example. And the vendors need to therefore be able to explain to us, how did you set your model up? What did you train your model on? Right? Is this trained on some generic, kind of best practices approach, or can I actually kind of feed it information and say, this is the kind of company we are. Here's what we are able to tolerate. Here's how we like it. So, in other words, can I shape your tool, right, to kind of work the way we work? And if I can't, God, that's going to be a headache extraordinaire over and over again. And I also this issue of explainability, man, and auditability is huge. So this whole thing is starting to blow up. It's interesting. You guys know Workday, obviously, a big tool.
yeah.
So a chap by the name of Mr. Mobley out in California, who is, I think he's north of 55 years old, and he applied through Workday tools over and over again, something like 75 times for jobs he knew he was either perfectly qualified for or even overqualified for, and was rejected every time. And he was like,
Mm,
oh, that's interesting. what is the common denominator here? Age, right? Or is it, something related to, a disability I told you about or whatever the case? And he decided to say, I'm not dealing with this anymore. This is a problem. This is a systemic computer problem, an algorithmic problem. I know it. And he basically brought them to court in California.
Mm,
He
mm,
then he then drummed up a whole bunch of support, and now it's a class action lawsuit. It's huge in the bill,
mm,
and they're going after Workday to say you basically have a system that automatically weeds out people of an age, right? Or people with certain disabilities, or whatever the case. We can't put our finger on it. We can't go diving into your software, but it's working. And it can't be these 75 people who are now enjoined with me in this class action lawsuit. It's not just one of us, it's a lot of us.
mm.
And if Workday loses this, right, this is going to
Yeah,
be massive globally. So we don't want to be in the middle of one of those discussions, right? So
yeah.
that's important.
But I think the length of your reply and the nature of my question does suggest it could be a really good topic for another session,
Absolutely.
because undeniably we will be working with third parties and we need to ask them a certain suite of questions to be able to satisfy ourselves, and no one is going to have a monopoly on all of the knowledge, so we are going to be more codependent, so we need to be vetting
Well,
well.
and Justine, what these sales guys are like, and I'm not saying anything bad about salespeople. Love them if they're good. They can be super informative, but they typically are also overly exuberant, right? They need to be. They're
Mm,
permanent optimists, and they always ever want to find a way to yes, is kind of like their approach. The
mm,
problem with this is there is no dancing around whether or not this thing is capable of doing X and Y
mm,
is basically the algorithm it uses to make those decisions. If we can't have that level of discussion, then you can have all the exuberance and optimism in the world. I'm not going to believe you, right? I
mm,
can't put my
mm,
company at risk like that. I don't want to put myself
mm,
at risk like that. So I'm going to
mm,
be really careful about what it is I choose it to do. AI is brilliant also, like when it's in the reporting and analytics, side of the
mm,
um, but I want to basically shape the inquiries. I want to ask the questions quite carefully, like I do with my current prompts with LLMs and so forth. And I want it to work very much like that. And I always ever want to press that button to say, explain to me what your chain of thought was. How did you get
mm,
right? And why
mm.
did you end up on the final decision? So I think that's really essential.
Yeah, excellent, Jeff. Superb. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.